Just kidding. I'm like I say, I always show up. I always come prepared. We never take roll and just bring your own refreshments. Hunt's pizza sauce, cheap food. Let's see what this has here on the back. Wow, 26% sodium in one can, 4% fiber, 3% carbohydrates, a bunch of zero. Well, the good news is there's zero added sugars and 1 gram of protein. So this is a bunch of salt. Yeah, you probably ate it a lot. So I'm Kendall Brian Hunter, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point. And I already did the routine. It's the joke that I always show up, and we've probably had problems with Sunday school teachers who don't show up. This is kind of an interesting story. I was a Sunday school president in a student ward. This is for my second time, and we had well, it's not funny. It's a bit sad that one of the teachers just kept oversleeping. So I'd call and give him the wake-up call to make sure he'd show up, and he was a good teacher. At the end of the year, he flew home, was diagnosed with cancer, and then passed on in a matter of weeks. So that's kind of interesting things you do when you get a calling, and it's some ways it's good to get those types of experiences when you're younger, so when you're older, you do less damage to the church because you're experienced. So in the news, happy June. And remember to beware of pride, lest you become like the Nephites of old. That's D&C 3839. Also, we're starting to get the new hymns from the new hymnal. So the news says we're going to have around 400 or 500 hymns. Will be an interesting print job considering the damage and punishment hymn books go through. Although, I don't know if you've noticed, everyone's just singing off their phones and these hymn books just pile up there. The good news is they have guitar chords. That should be kind of fun. I do play the guitar. I noticed that in this first batch, they had 3 Protestant hymns, or traditionally Protestants. The first one was Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, which was actually in the 1947 hymn book, the one previously to the current one we're using. It got dropped out for some reason, and then, the BYU choir, and it's been sung around. It's a nice song. It's easy to play on the guitar, 3-chord progression. Another one is they have the Eye on the Sparrow, and then that's funny because I have this little footnote explaining what the expression portion is. The other one is It Is Well With My Soul, which actually has an interesting story. It's written by a man whose family died in a transatlantic shipwreck. And he was sailing over the spot where his family died and wrote the words to this hymn, and later they have music. Because, the words in the music sometimes have different lives and different custodianship or creation. So let me do a little bit of adjusting with my tablet. I think this is sort of a side comment on it. Hymn books are kind of up in the air. They're written and recorded, they're compiled according to wisdom. Emma Smith's hymn book, had a lot of hymns from traditional ones, also ones from Parley P. Pratt and W.W. Phelps. Later on with Eliza R. Snow's started writing stuff. But I was kind of concerned about this need to mimic Protestants and to Protestantize our religion. Celebrating Passion Week or Holy Week is a good instance of that. It's something really wasn't a problem. It's not traceable back to Joseph Smith. I'm having some technical difficulties. We have issues with a lot of converts. We have that base there, and having a symbol make things a little bit more familiar. We also have some of the influencers in the church or converts. Probably the most prominent is Glenn Beck, but you have the Sisters in Zion, and you have Al Fox Caraway. And it's kind of interesting because this was an issue when you have people coming into the church. Joseph Smith noticed this problem. It says, it's often the case that young members of the church, for want of better information, carry along with them their old notions of things and sometimes fall into egregious errors. These are not little small things. These are egregious errors, according to Joseph Smith. And we have a revelation that talks about that. Section 49.4, which I'll get into next year, assuming I'm still alive. And when you have a convert who's a social media influencer and having influence in the church, another one's Thomas Griffith, who's also Judge Griffith, who's a convert. So they have good voices, and we always welcome everyone, but there's a danger of these egregious errors that Joseph Smith warned about, that things get a little bit corrupted. I had a stake president who was a convert. I noticed it going on once in a meeting. He'd have things like prayer meetings before sacrament meeting, with part of the before you'd have the sacrament meeting. He wanted the people who are giving talks to have a prayer meeting. He wanted us to report home teaching by standing up in quorum and reporting it. Now, you understand that's a psychological pressure, but that's not how you're supposed to do things, because you have confidential information that should not be brought before the quorum body. Where he once referred to Peter as the rock upon which the church was built. That's good Catholic doctrine, but that's not what we believe. It's the Holy Ghost, as Joseph Smith taught. Well, this has been a bit of a hard thing to put together, and I think I reached a point where, when I was preparing this, I hit the deadline, so I just had to abandon it. But it's tied with a big news story that's oddly coincidental, because we're reading this right now, is that President Donald Trump was convicted with 34 felonies. It's a perfect news story considering what we're covering today. So I'm not going to force feed you an opinion, and everyone's welcome to this party, this broadcast I have, and so I like hearing from all sides. But there's a danger of filtering what happened with President Trump through the lens of party affiliation, as opposed to the lens of the Book of Mormon. And we're going to talk about the lens of the Book of Mormon through this. I think it was Elder D. Todd Christofferson spoke about Elder B.H. Roberts, who was a general authority, one of the 7 presidents of the 70, and he had issues with some of the political party allegiance, where he was getting tempted to be more allegiant to his political party rather than to the church, and he was almost booted out of the out of the leadership of the church. At the same time, we had another apostle named Moses Thatcher, who decided he wanted to be a good member of his political party rather than be a good apostle, and he was dropped. And I bring this up because I grew up with Elder Moses Thatcher's great-grandchildren, and they're still out of the church. Just make sure you understand where your allegiance is. If you're more allegiant to your political party than to the church, that's the wrong direction. Also, there is this statement from President Ezra Taft Benson. It's in chapter 10. This may be a supersized one again, just given the news story. Ezra Taft Benson, chapter 10. The Book of Mormon was written for our day. If they saw our day and chose those things which would be of greatest worth to us, is not that how we should study the Book of Mormon? We should constantly ask ourselves, why did the Lord inspire Mormon or Moroni or Alma to include that in his record? What lessons can I learn from that to help me live it in this day and age? And that's exactly what this lesson's about. Is we have a shift in government, we have a disputed election, an insurrection, one of the two mentioned in the Book of Mormon, the other one is with the kingmen. So, yeah, very timely. I'm not going to tell you what to think. We'll just talk about what the Book of Mormon has to say, and you keep it running in the back of your mind. So the theme today is Alma and the Stain of the Amlicites. Sounds like a good movie. And so the question I want you to consider this, given the potential for abuses and the abuses inherent in democracy, is democracy worth it? So let's dive into the Book of Mormon. So this, okay, there we go. Declared I'm getting some notifications there. So Mosiah chapter 29. So the last chapter, they translated the Jaredite record, and they realized, wait a minute, kings are a bad idea. In Mosiah chapter 29, what happens is the sons of Mosiah go out and do the missionary work. So you don't have Aaron, who's I'm assuming the eldest son who would have been the king. He's out doing missionary work, and Mosiah hits this problem. Okay, who's going to take over the king, the throne? And he's at the same time he has these records on. He says, okay, look, we've translated these records. You've read them, you've studied them, and you look at King Noah, then the Jaredite kings. But you also have King Mosiah, King Benjamin, and the second King Mosiah. King Limhi is also a good king. And is just having a king, is that the best order? And you see that this also with the Jaredites have the same question. Okay, is if you have a king, what problems have? What are the downsides of having a king? Well, the king has these corrupt law. He has these cronies and minions. And since they hold office, it gives the color of legitimacy. You have when you hold a political office, you have the power of discretion. So you can tweak things in favor of the church or tweak things against the church. And it gives, since you hold the office, you have legitimacy and you can do that. I was told this when I minored in political science, and Dave Magleby, who is the instructor of the class, talked about, get a job with the State Department so missionaries can get their visas. It's within your discretional power to do that. So it goes on. You have the human predicament problem, Federalist 9, written by Alexander Hamilton. So we get Alexander Hamilton today, and he spoke of the state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. So you have a lot going on here. The problem of, who's the king when the heir apparent doesn't want to be here and he's off doing missionary work? Is the problem with having kings? How do you handle this the predicament between tyranny and anarchy? Which is what happened to the Jaredites later with the Nephites when you throw secret combinations into the mix. So he proposed a new system, and it's really an old system of going back to Moses, the judges. This is in Exodus chapter 18, verses 13 through 26, and this is where Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, says, look, you can't judge all the people on your own, so you start delegating out the judicial system. So you have the judges, that's the political order in Moses' day. You'd have the prophet, who is Moses. Then you have the priests, or the Levites, who controlled the temple worship. That you had to be a temple worker. You had to be born into a certain tribe. Then you have the assembly, which is the churches, and you have the tribes, or the clans, the various tribes of Israel. And that's what the political system was like in Moses' day. And he said, let's go back to that, and let's have higher and lower judges. And if there's a problem, we have an impeachment process where the lower judges can be tried by higher judges, and the lower judges, and vice versa, that you do that. And then he makes this statement, which you've probably been seeing on the internet a lot, mostly from people who are conservative. They point out, and if the time comes that the voice of the people doth choose iniquity, then is the time that the judgments of God will come upon you. Yea, then is the time he will visit you with great destruction, even he has hitherto visited this land. Referring back to the Jaredites. So he says, look, it's you have to trust the common sense of the people. William F. Buckley said, I'm obliged to confess I should sooner live in a society governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than in a society governed by the 2,000 faculty members of Harvard University. It's just pull names out of a telephone book. I trust them more than I trust academia. Thomas Jefferson said, state a moral case to a plowman and a professor. The former will decide it well and is often better than the latter because he has not been led astray by artificial rules. So you trust the common people to have common sense. And that's what King Mosiah is saying right here. You trust people. And it's kind of interesting is some of the problems you have is, do the elites not trust the unwashed masses, the hoi polloi? Yeah, that goes on there. Now, another thing to keep in mind is this is not the U.S. Constitution. You're not reading about separation of powers. You have the judges who have, of course, judicial power, but they have the laws of King Mosiah, and the judges would issue rulings, but you have these laws, so it's more like a civil code approach, where you have an inquisitorial rather than adversarial approach like we have in the United States of America. So it's closer to a civil code like in Louisiana with a Napoleonic code or Justinian code. You had marshals who would enforce the law. I'm not sure about the army, but apparently the chief judge ran the army. Of course, the important one is the IRS, who is how do you collect taxes? Maybe you just didn't, and you had voluntary contributions. And then you had of course, the church going on, and the term high priest does not refer to the office of high priest. It always refers to the leader of a congregation. So it wasn't like a temple worker. It was just the leader of the congregation, what we call the president of the stake or something like that. Now, this is kind of an interesting approach in political science in Federalist 12, written by James Madison. He talked about that there's this debated issue that you have a democracy, it works in a small area, but not a large area. And you have these small communities are homogenous, people know each other. When it gets really big, it gets hard to manage. Case in point is Rome. Okay, Rome was a city, and the Roman government started as a municipal government. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. They won the three of the two of the three Punic Wars, and eventually controlled Europe. But how do you manage it? It just doesn't get managed well. Rome, of course, broke apart into the smaller areas. And so we have this new order set up as voted on, and Alma, the younger, who went from critic to chief judge, from apostate to high priest, and then now the chief judge. So there's the passing of the old guard, and the new order is set up. Takes us to Alma 1, and this is a good place to break, because there's a change in the culture. There's two words to describe this new energy that goes on there. One is Weltanschauung, which means worldview. Worldview, it's a German term. Then the other one is a German term, Zeitgeist, or spirit of the age. So you have your worldview, your sense of how reality works, your sense of life. Then you have the spirit of the age. And there's a shift in the worldview and the shift in the spirit of the age. For example, the early 1960s was an extension of the 50s, but later on it started getting more psychedelic. We have the hippies. 1970 is very brown and burnt orange, sort of coming down from the riots of the 1960s. 1980s, you have the pink and blue from Miami Vice and neon. 1990s, where everyone was wearing plaid from the grunge, and so on and so on. World War II, that has a certain feel to it. That's what a zeitgeist is, the feel of the age. And you have this fundamental, massive shift. So you had a generational shift. Let me go back and say that you had the shift in the worldview. So you had this openness to possibilities, where you just didn't have a king, but anyone can become a king. And it's a bit like Jacob's era, Jacob in the early part of the Book of Mormon, where there's expansion and wealth and prosperity. And you have this, that shift creates a new energy. You have the new generation, this lost generation, the apostate generation, where apostasy is commonplace and in some sense expected, like it is right now. You've had people leave the church, and it's the same thing where, okay, apostasy is no big deal. And so you have the generational change, you have the political order change, you have a democracy set up, a republic. You don't have the Nephite caste of kings, because remember, all the kings carried the throne name of Nephi, and you had to be a Nephite to be a king over the Amlicites for some reason. That's because the Nephites had the records and they had the cultural energy, so they're able to become the dominant power. And that's very common in Reed Toynbee's study of history. And you have the change in the religious orders. At Alma the Elder, you have this the Church of Abinadi to Alma the Elder to Alma the Younger. And so you have new blood. It's the same doctrine, but there's an energy. And you've had that when your ward gets divided or you get a new bishop, that there's energy changes in the ward. There's a new direction. You just wear out people sometimes. And the new blood and new energy strengthens things. I think it's a little bit interesting. What's missing is in Plato's Republic, he talked about that when there's a change in the music, there's a change in the political system, and that when music changes, state changes. You saw it like in the 50s and 60s with Elvis and the Beatles. There's a change in the type of music that became popular, and there's a change in government. Same thing in the 80s with techno music, 90s with grunge. Right now we're at the cult of Taylor Swift. And does that mean anything for our politics? And so what we're going to do in this section, study two case studies, Nehor and Amlicites, where this is where democracy goes wrong and how to deal with it. So in chapter 1, is you have this new religion starts, and it's Nehor. And he's self-appointed, he's physically tall, that's a type of beauty bias. He's really into expensive clothing. He believes that priests should be popular and they should get paid as opposed to working by their hands like we do in the church. And he taught a new doctrine, and it's one we'd call universal reconciliation. Sometimes gets expressed as love wins. Now, this is not predestination per se, but it's kind of close to irresistible grace, that God will save you, so just don't sweat anything. It's just all mercy, and you can see why that would appeal to lawyers who deal with law 24/7. And you see sort of the downside with the negative aspects of Protestantism's focus on grace. It just sort of becomes an all-consuming thing, which messes up the religion. So why is this appealing? Well, there's a physical aspect, the clothing, and the popular and charismatic leaders. Remember the great and spacious building where they all wore fine clothing. It's a guilt-free religion. Don't sweat it. God will save you. God created you. God will save you. God doesn't make junk. Yeah, stuff that Lucifer taught in the War in Heaven. It's low anxiety. But also, this is a place for all these apostate Nephites, the unchurched, the nuns, could congregate to fill their need of spirituality. When they left the church, you have to fill the vacuum somehow. So he was preaching. He meets Gideon. Gideon contends with him. This is Gideon from the Nephite. Nehor kills him. He gets tried, and make the point is like, yeah, you're introducing priestcraft, where you're getting paid for your religion. That's going to destroy the community. You're going to destroy our Nephite republic. Plus, you're also guilty of homicide. And so they had the trial. He renounces it, just like Sherman Korihor, and then he suffers an ignominious or a nameless death. We don't know what it is because it wasn't named, but the movement carried on. And there's a division in the community where you have the members of the church just meekly serve without money, and then you have these weird behaviors that non-members engage in: babblings, contention, witchcraft. Yeah, these alternative religions, which we see nowadays. So that's a shift, and that's the sad lesson of Nehor. Once you open up things, people like Nehor rise to the top and create these movements that last on and on. And like I said, the lawyers were really into this. So Alma 2 is, we're going to study one of the two insurrections. The other one is in Alma 51 with Kingman and the Freemen, Alma 51, 52, 53. So you have Amlicites. Now, he's an order of Nehor, very important. His personal beliefs that affect his politics. And there's that popular aspect of the order of Nehor where anyone can rise to the top. So I'm kind of curious, as like during January 6th, no one discussed this. This wasn't mentioned in general conference about Amlicites and then the Kingmen, about insurrections, etc., like that. So I can cover it. I can do whatever I want to with this. And so as the election said, hey, we should go back to having a king. I want to be king. There was put to the vote. Yet. And he ignored the results of the election and then started a revolt. And so the question is, okay, how closely does Amlicites match up with Donald Trump? Yay and nay, do a comparison. And just figure that out on your own. So you have this big fight. One of the funny things you read there is an area called Hermounts, which is close to the Egyptian word Hermonthis. They fight, and there's a danger of the Amlicites forming an alliance with the Lamanites. So they get really busy, and, the Lord's with the Nephites. So case study number 2, the stain of the Amlicites, insurrection, not accepting the elections of a result and not going away peacefully. It's one thing not accepting, but it's the leading of violence is the problem. Leading violence against the body politic. Now, Alma 3 is interesting. It starts out rounding out the discussion of the previous chapter, mentioning the collateral damages, the crops and the flocks that are lost. So when you fight a war, there's always famine if your crops get endangered, and they don't have freezers. It's what's in the barnyard, what's in the farm, or else you starve to death. But also the section, there's an aside in this section where, I guess it's Mormon. He gives some commentary. He says one thing that the Amlicites did is they marked their head, their forehead or their head with a red mark to set themselves apart. And these, he cites these revelations that aren't in here. These actually may be holdovers from the 116 pages, or they may be back from an older source where the Lord talks about this. And this goes back to the skin issue, the skin coloration issues with the Lamanites, where God puts a mark upon people to distinguish faithful from unfaithful people. And that not just with the Lamanites would apply to the Amlicites, with them marking their forehead with red. And then also just all people who dissent from the church mark themselves. So the question is, the churches completely disavowed racist understandings of the Lamanite skin and the skin curse. So I'm going to repeat that. I disavow it, the first presidency has, but I have a question. Okay, so if it doesn't mean that, what exactly does it mean? You're kind of left us with a little bit of a vacuum, so I don't have any good answer with that, and I'm not going to speculate. But think about this nowadays. How are ways that some people mark themselves as a sign of apostasy or dissension? Yeah, like I said, I'm not going to force feed you answers. Think about this because you need to understand the principle, not the application. So that aside is done. We're going into Alma 4 right now. And you have another problem. So religious dissension, political dissension, this is a little bit of a side. And what happened is that the Nephites who are faithful, they get really prosperous because they're not babbling and involved in witchcraft. And so they become rich and they start coveting property. And that's the thing to think about is as you get older, you make more money, and are you coveting property? Also, I think there's a ripple effect from the Order of Nehor. See, the Order of Nehor was about clothing, snubbing people. You had the sizable body of apostates who were also members of the Order of Nehor, and then the saints start buying into some of the things, like with the clothing that the Order of Nehor were into. And things get out of hand that what it says is that the members of the church were a bad example to non-members. In fact, being a member of the church is being worse than being a non-member, that it just became a corruption or a hive of corruption. Now, that's a broad statement, because in our next lesson next week, we'll talk about, once again, 2 case studies, Zarahemla and then the city of Gideon. And Zarahemla, which is the old decaying trunk of the tree. And then Gideon was a newer colony named after Gideon, who was killed. And they didn't seem to have the problems that the older entrenched one. And you see this with old wards. We just have old entrenched lines of authority, people who think they're entitled to serve in callings, people who have served in callings, people who are high priests who think they're better than anyone else. And it becomes a problem. It just disrupts the church. So what happens is at the end of this chapter, Alma hands off the political leadership to Nephite. If I forgot to put that, I think that's off the top of my head. So, this is the one of 2 times where this happens. So Alma 4 does it, and then also in Elon chapter 5, Nephi, son of Nephi, hands it off. And so you think you cannot be the chief judge and be the high priest. You cannot be president of the United States and be president of the church. It's too time consuming. I've seen this happen where people just try and juggle too many balls. This is why the church has the one person, one calling policy, because you overwork someone, you get them stretched too thin, it doesn't work well. So I'm just going to keep hammering that, because I've had people try and do this to me, and it's just like, okay, I'm going to have one of these, I'm going to have to do it myself too. I'm just giving you bare minimum, because you're violating church policy. You as a leader do not have keys to override church policy. This is what the First Presidency says, is one person, one calling. Handbook, section 30.1.1. And that's where today's lesson ends. My throat's getting a little bit dry. Like I said, there's a lot to talk about here just with what's going on in the world right now. And I hope you're finding answers in the Book of Mormon to what's going on in the world right now. So you have the Christ quotient, this new generation, the new political order, the new religious order, and how do these changes affect stability? But more importantly, in these unstable times, how are you turning to Christ? And how does Christ bring stability into your life? What's Christ's view about new religions? Well, Christ has his own religion. What about politics? Yeah, there's certain principles of politics found in the scriptures. The Constitution mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants several times. What's it like to interact with people of other faiths? People who are actively persecuting us, which is what the Order of Nehor did, is they persecuted the saints, even though they had the pre-existing anti-persecution laws. How to treat people who have left the church. Well, this is how I do it when I interact with people. When I show up to like some activities, there's a booth there, I'll say, hi, how are you doing? So tell me about your church. And just let them get the speech out. They'll want to make a speech, they'll get it out. Once it gets done, you thank them. Then I ask them, okay, what are some of the big challenges you're facing in your church? Because that's going to be helpful, because you may have some common problems with our church and their church with the challenges. And I'll say, look, we probably won't convert each other, but we certainly can talk to each other. And here's another thing, too. Think about the specifics of the Order of Nehor. Okay, what's exactly problematic with that doctrine? One of them is there's no covenants. It's mercy robbing justice. Behavior doesn't mean anything if you're all going to get saved. You can be Hitler or Mother Teresa, but you're going to get saved. Okay, so what does righteousness mean? The stain of Amlicites. How do righteous people, what physical marks do righteous people and wicked people put upon themselves to distinguish themselves? Or what are some of the marks that wicked people put on themselves to distinguish themselves from other people? Christ and politics. So this is a little bit fluid. In the Book of Mormon and the scriptures, they did not have separation of church and state. In our country, we have First Amendment, plus we have the religious test clause in the Constitution where you can't offer a religious test. This is what Harold B. Lee taught, and it's from the book Ye Are the Light of the World. President Harold B. Lee. Oh, we're at half an hour. That's why I'm so tired. During political campaigns, some members say, why doesn't the church tell us how we should vote? If the church did that, we would have a lot of Democrats or Republicans who would want to apostatize. We believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates. We're told that if we will obey the laws of God, we will have no need to break the laws of the land. When people ask me whom to vote for, I'll tell them to read Mosiah 29 and D.C. 134 of the Doctrine and Covenants, to pray about it, and they will know whom to vote for in any given election. It's just as simple as that. So one of the sections is what we read here, then section 134, which is a statement on governments. I'd throw in there 1 Samuel 8, where Samuel warns about the dangers of kings. But read those three sections and you'll have the discernment. So my question is, granted the dangers of democracy, is it worth it? I say, yeah, look at the alternatives. The problem isn't a structural problem, it's a human nature problem. And so people try and solve human nature problem with structure. And we did that, read Federalist 51. If men were angels, they'd need no government. So you have to set up a structure which takes human nature into account, which the expressly the American government does. They read the Federalist Papers, they do talk about human nature in there. And they took that into account in setting up our government. So James Madison in Federalist 63 said, liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty as well as by the abuses of power. Liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty as well as the abuses of power. And you see that with Amlicites and Nehor. They're abusing their liberty. So when you have abuses of liberty, or this vibration between tyranny and anarchy, what's the solution to that? Well, the solution is Jesus Christ. And that's the point.